And what you emailed. Yeah, I know you said you were going to get. Okay, all right.
Hey, Richard, can you hear us okay?
It's 5:15.
I mean,
Maybe it's 5:15.
it's fine. No, it's fine. It's just I'll make sure I have the right copy. I'm just trying to make sure. Okay.
Yep.
All right, it is 7 o'clock. We do have all members of the Board of Supervisors here as a quorum, so we will call the meeting to order. Begin with an invocation, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. God, thank you for all allowing us to gather here tonight safely. Please be with us as we do the county's work tonight. Grant us guidance and wisdom so that we can do the best for the citizens of Amelia. Please be with everyone who's unable to be here tonight. Grant them health and safety. And please be with all of those here on our way home for safe passage. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Everybody should have a copy of the agenda. Do we have any additions or changes needed for tonight's agenda? All right, we've got three main items on here, and we will jump into them. Thank you, Patty, for joining us, and also for Jeff on this topic as well. Although Jeff may be related to all topics tonight. Thank you in advance. But we'll begin with, I really don't like calling it a clutter ordinance because it's not, but we'll go with the ordinance that we've been discussing. And Patty, let you take it over for some updates on what's happened since last time and walk us through it.
Okay, well, I just looked at other jurisdictions, other counties similar to us, and just kind of put together, took out some things from ours, put in some things from theirs, and sent it to Jeff to look over, and just, highlighted some things I thought everybody should weigh in on. Jeff did mention, I'd kind of put them into separate articles under the same ordinance, but he wants to break them all out. Solid waste being one, tires being one, weeds and garbage being another, and inoperable vehicles being a fourth.
Okay.
And so.
That'll deal with our naming problem then. That's better.
Yes. It'll be simpler.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeff, did you have some input on the changes?
So one of the things you all talked about in previous meetings was the enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
And so what Patty did in her draft, and I added a few things to her draft. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that yet. I just sent it this afternoon, but so some of the things we put in there deal with having a civil penalty instead of a criminal penalty where it's allowed. And so examples of that are in the first one dealing with solid waste. Let's see. On I don't know if you have, it's on page 5 of page 6 of the version I sent this afternoon, but I just added a placeholder for civil penalties. This statute's interesting. Unlike the other ones that are the other ordinances that are in this document, this statute, this enabling statute in state law, does not prescribe civil penalties. It just says the county can have civil penalties. So, there's not, very prescriptive language in the statute, in the state code for how those penalties are set up. So I think what we probably do is borrow from the civil penalties provisions that are prescribed for some of these other ordinances and put that in this part of the code, a part of the ordinance, if that's what you all wanted to do. Again, this one deals with essentially using the convenience centers, using the landfill correctly, transportation of waste. It's those provisions that are in your, and disposition of waste, using right receptacles, not misusing the landfill, things like that. So those are all drawn from your current ordinance. This would be a standalone ordinance that just deals with those issues. Patty, I'm sure, has made some updates based on looking at other local ordinances, and I've laid some updates on top of that. So the only question on this one would be, do you want to do civil penalties? And you don't have to decide that tonight, obviously, but that's something to think about. And it may be once you've looked at the other ordinances in here that you can see how they relate, and you can decide if you want them to be the same parallel civil penalty or keep it criminal, because it's not the exact subject matter. The next part is weeds and garbage.
Can we pause? Can we pause there for just a second, Jeff? That's
Yes, sir.
helpful. I just kind of little polling of the board. I think we've talked about this now a number of times. I think we were pretty clear we wanted it to be more easily enforceable, and that we had agreed then the direction with that to go was the civil penalties. Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, consensus around. So I think the next draft can move forward with the civil penalties section being added, even if they, as you said, don't list or they're not prescribed by state code, then we can go ahead and add them in to that next draft. That was a good point you brought up, just to
Yep.
try to give you some answers before we forget.
I appreciate that.
Mhm,
Okay.
Thank you.
We can do that.
Where did the numbers in section 16 come from?
Well, I was gonna say, that's where, I mean, we do have that,
Oh, we do already.
have the civil penalties there. Under weeds and garbage.
Oh, just not under the other.
Not applying.
Right.
So he's
So-
gonna need to break. it. So next version, let's just start with, make sure we're all clear. Next version, we'll break it into 4 different ordinances. You'll have the penalty section then added to each of the 4 and be able to then start customizing them to the 4 different topics.
Correct.
So- Okay.
Is the process for investigation of complaints gonna be in this?
That's a good point.
And
It is.
And who makes a decision? That's not in this, this will be in something, that'll be in something else.
It would be added if we want to, use what we're going to talk about in a minute. In this first ordinance, then it would set all that out. Yes. Excuse me.
Section
The
14.
weeds and garbage.
Looks like it starts with 13, like 13 into 14. So you would take, again, similar language to that only applies right now on weeds and garbage, and replicate across the 4 with modifications to match.
Right.
Okay.
That's correct. And you'll see as we go through each one how they differ in that regard. But
Mhm.
because sometimes they do based on state law, they have to differ.
Right.
But if you, so going to the next one, which I think is where the phrase clutter ordinance keeps popping up from. This is the ordinance where clutter would be part of it. This is the weed and garbage on property ordinance that state law now allows clutter to be addressed as well. So this would be just an update to those provisions in your current solid waste ordinance as a standalone ordinance to update it for to be consistent with current state law. And the penalty, the penalty provision in this one, it shows as, if you're looking at the document I marked up, then
We don't have,
There went to.
just so you know, we don't have copies of that one. Taylor's going to get copies of that.
you don't, okay, I'm sorry.
That's all right, just so you know.
So that version, because Patty's language is shown, it's not shown as new language. That's because her entire draft is, some of it's new, some of it's old. So it's not, hers is not a marked up version. So because what we're doing is repealing your entire solid waste ordinance and replacing it with these. So she didn't show every change. So the track changes that you'll see and what Taylor's going to hand out are my recent changes on top of hers. But you'll see in section what is in the version you have now, section 16, has a penalty provision. That's not in your current ordinance.
No.
That would be new. And that's from state law. So that's a civil penalty provision, and the notice and the enforcement and all that we could use in the ordinance we were just talking about. The next one, tires. Again, it would pull this out and make it a standalone. The only, so one interesting thing about this is it's pretty much covered by state enforcement. DEQ has authority over unlawful storage or disposal of waste tires. That's in Title 10.1 of the state code, and it's a criminal penalty under state law. So this one, I didn't change the penalty in this one because I really don't see a provision in state law that allows a local ordinance to have civil penalties for this topic. However, one approach you could consider taking, Holly can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that tire storage is addressed in the zoning ordinance. It might be. I didn't get to that today. One angle is to put it tied to the zoning ordinance, and we can at some point talk about amending your zoning ordinance to have civil penalties versus misdemeanor penalties. Really didn't make significant changes to what Patty.
Does the one you sent have changes in it?
But it won't print out that way.
I know, but we can.
That's
see
the
it.
one, yeah.
Okay.
The emailed one is the one. And that's the way it prints out without the track changes. I'm not sure
I
what.
don't know that the zoning ordinance addresses storage of tires. It's pretty much just like tire recapping and vulcanization and all that stuff.
Okay.
Hey, Jeff, I just wanted to point out, yeah, DEQ deals with waste tires and illegally dumped tires and so forth.
Yeah.
What we run into in Amelia is tire dealers and used tire dealers. And we've had problems there. And so we need to somehow have an ordinance where we can control them.
Okay. That makes sense. You want me to share my screen, Mr. Chair?
I think it's as simple if they're stored undercover. They're not collecting water, they're not mosquito, and they're basically out of sight.
Right.
I mean,
I mean, we could require that, I think.
as far as somebody that
Jeff-
claims that they're using them as a reseller, used tire reseller. I mean,
Mhm. Want to share?
because that's DEQ's
Yeah, you can share.
business.
Yeah, you're welcome to
Yes,
share
sir.
your screen if you'd like.
Okay. If you can see it, then you can see some of my markups. Again, I apologize for not getting that to staff earlier.
While he's pulling it up, can you make sure you work with Brenda tomorrow morning then to have this posted as materials from today's meeting then? Okay. Thanks.
So do you see the page that says weeds and garbage ordinance?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just very quickly, I'll go back up to the top. What we would do here is make each one an ordinance and then here's the changes I added to the solid waste ordinance would be, one, I just made a note that the recycling provisions were removed. So I think you all had a discussion at the last meeting about taking that out. So I think that's what, right, Patty? That's what you did there.
Yes.
Mhm.
And then, so I just made a note of that for your reference, and that wouldn't be in the ordinance. And then penalties, this is where I just have a placeholder. We got to pick civil or criminal. Currently, it's criminal in the current ordinance, $500 fine up to $2,500 and up to a year in jail. So what we can do there, based on your direction, is put the civil penalty provision in, similar to the one here in the weeds and garbage ordinance. So in the weeds and garbage ordinance, I just made a few updates to the definitions based on state law. That's the track changes there. That just mirrors state laws verbatim. That's what these changes do. Yeah. So the only real significant thing I did was make a few updates to the to the civil penalty provision. It just makes it clear that there actually is a criminal option, but that's only if you got to a certain point. And that is if you have multiple violations, three civil penalty violations that aren't from the same set of facts. So just a repeat offender. That's what,
Maybe you could do something similar for the tires portion that Patty was talking about, address our civil penalties and then say something like, and in these cases, then the state criminal penalties, apply so that
right.
kind of almost like this when it kind of flows depending on what it pertains to, I guess, what part of
Right, we can make it fit with, there's actually there's a no preemption provision in the DEQ code sections in the state code that makes it very clear that no local ordinance can preempt their authority.
Okay.
But I would make sure they mesh properly. So just getting back where we were, the tire ordinance. Again, I didn't change the penalty, but we can do that. We can look at putting in a civil penalty option there too. I didn't change anything else that Patty did there. Patty, you highlighted some things. Is that anything you want to speak to?
Yeah, that closure plan I just copied, I think, from Powhatan, and I wasn't sure it applied to us. I didn't really understand it with the dates and all of them. You know anything about that?
This is very DEQ sounding.
Yeah,
So,
it is.
you know what we may want to do, Patty, is there a regional DEQ person that you talk to or have a contact with?
Yes, I talked to one quite a bit about one of our facilities here in Amelia that sells used tires. And he was completely hands off. They said, we have nothing whatsoever to do with the sale of used tires.
Sale of used tires. Well, they have everything to do with storage and disposal, so that's interesting.
He would not help me at all.
Okay, maybe we need to find someone else. But my advice there is that we find someone at DEQ to run the tire ordinance by.
Okay, I'll see if I can find somebody else. He did have a supervisor.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's a quick haul.
Yeah, it did to me.
So the next one would be,
Mm-hmm.
so the next ordinance would be to have a standalone inoperable vehicle ordinance. This just tracks state code. I made a few updates to what Patty had sent me. That's all that does. We're talking, it deals with motor vehicles, semi-trailers, and trailers. Those are inoperable as defined in state code, which is tracked here in your ordinance. Then you can regulate them, require them to be screened or shielded from view, or enclosed in an enclosed structure. Now you can set the limit of vehicles that can be outside screened. And that's what this does in section A. Has a different limit for residential versus agricultural of number of inoperable vehicles that can be that can both be visible or screened. And that's, I don't know, Patty, if you want to explain that. Did that come from another county or was that existing?
Yes, that came from another county. It sounded better to me than the one we had before, that you had to be standing on the property line or something. This one.
So y'all can look at that. Let us, give us some feedback if you have any. This one, we still have, and Patty, you highlighted this, and my note is, we got to pick one, civil or criminal. So we would strike this provision. I'll do it right now, just for a good measure. And then we would have a civil penalty provision. Now, this one's different than the ones we just discussed as far as civil penalties. This section of the code for inoperable vehicles points to the state code provision that allows civil penalties for zoning ordinance violations. That doesn't mean that this is part of the zoning ordinance. It just means that state code requires any civil penalties to be adopted the same way they would be adopted if we had civil penalties under the zoning ordinance. So that's very prescribed in state law. And so this essentially is, nearly a cut and paste of the state law process for civil penalties for zoning ordinances. For some reason, that's what the General Assembly decided to apply in the framework of the inoperable vehicle enforcement. So that's what this, so it's, you can tell how prescriptive it is.
Wow. Yeah.
That's just drawn from state code, and that talks about the whole process that the county has to go through. Notice, summonsing, issuing a summons, getting a court order, all that. Because it's civil doesn't mean the county doesn't necessarily have to go to court. What it does mean is there's the opportunity for the property owner to pay off the civil, kind of like a speeding ticket, although that's not civil. There's the opportunity for the property owner to pay off a civil fine, in addition to abate the problem. And if the county does have to go to court to get a judgment, it's obviously it's a much lower threshold to much lower standard of proof, preponderance of evidence in a civil case versus beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal case. So that does get to the board's interest in ease of enforceability. And I think it's better for both the landowner and property owner and the county. It's easy for the county to enforce. It's also easy for the landowner to deal with and can simply handle administratively and pay off a fine in essence versus having to deal with a criminal proceeding or risk having a criminal record for something like this. So that's it, Patty. Did I go back to the top? Did I leave anything out?
I don't think so. If anybody has any questions, just shoot them at us.
All right, we're gonna put this back then on the workshop agenda for next month. Can I make a request that we try to get the draft then for next month to us about a week in advance so that we can then, as you're making more and more progress now, we can have enough time then to give you some tangible feedback before or at least during the meeting. Okay. Anyone else have any other comments or questions for them tonight? All right.
If I can figure out how to stop sharing, Mr. Chair, I'll do that.
All right. We'll let you.
Go up to the, okay, well.
Thank you. There you go. You got it. Thank you, Patty. We appreciate that very much. All right, we'll move on to our next topic. Thank you, Richard, for joining us. As we requested last month, kind of related to the last one. Appreciate you coming to talk to us about the building department procedures regarding complaints for blight or unsafe buildings.
So Richard wasn't at the last workshop, so when he asked what he was supposed to be talking about, I told him y'all also wanted to talk about his process for condemning property.
Oh, that's what I meant by
Because that was something
Yeah.
that come up, so that's
Correct.
probably, okay,
That's right.
okay, all right.
All right, well, let's take it away, Richard.
Sure. Good evening. So the building code does not address blight whatsoever. The building code only addresses in this situation unsafe structures. So if a structure is deemed unsafe, it can be, if you want to use the term condemned, the code doesn't use that term. It says demolished. And the process for that can be simple or not so simple. If the structure is found to be unsafe and I deem it, the building official deems it to be unsafe and needs to be demolished, if the owner of the structure doesn't agree to that, then the building official can still order that demolition, and through the court system can actually bill the landowner for the demolition.
Does that mean there's no process? Does that mean there's no process for them to, instead of demolishing, for them to repair?
Oh, sure. That's first. If the building can be repaired, and I would say the bulk of them, if you got enough money, you can fix anything.
Yeah.
Whether you want to do that, provide that layout of funds is up to you, but yes, it can be repaired first. So what happens if I see an unsafe structure or get a complaint of one, I contact the landowner, try to have a conversation about what's wrong with it and give them the opportunity to repair it, usually give them prescribed time to do that depending on the severity of the problem. So yes, that's always first.
And that, Richard, that's any building, a dwelling or say a barn. That's any building. Is that right?
Yes, my interpretation of the code just says structure. However, the building code does not address agricultural buildings, and our generic term of ag buildings incorporates agriculture, horticulture, silviculture, aquaculture, anything. We say that's an ag building, but it encompasses a lot more than just that. So I to answer the question, I guess never been asked that, but I don't think that would be a Jeff question about that. Whether or not the code where it says structure, does that include any type of structure? Since the code doesn't address anything agricultural, specifically exempts it, am I able to enforce that part of it? I'd have to ask legal for that.
And generally, I think the building code exempts farm structures. So I mean, you'd have to go into the state, the building code definition of that, but generally they're exempt.
That's good. As long as we don't start trying to take down all the barns that are out in the county.
Well, the barns aren't unsafe regardless.
A lot of them I wouldn't go in. So yes, I agree with that.
What is we didn't get a copy of the ordinance you're referring to. Are you able to send us the current copy and point out the sections you're referring to?
Yeah, the county ordinance is fairly brief in that it just says that the county will adopt the current version of the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code, USBC for short. And that USBC also encompasses a number of the other model codes for enforcement. So sure, I can send you the excerpt from the USBC that covers unsafe structures. Sure.
Yeah, so let's see our code and then the pieces that it references. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, never mind. Thank you. All right.
Is there another piece that specifically targets dwelling where people are living? I mean, because that's kind of a whole, I think that's more what we're asking about anyway. When you have a house that has faulty wiring or no plumbing and no electricity, how does that work? Or is it all rolled into the same?
All right. So if you as a homeowner have faulty wiring, you as the homeowner are either fix it or live with it. If you are a tenant, let's say in a rental property, if I receive a tenant complaint, let me back up. The county did not adopt the Virginia Property Maintenance Code. So nothing falls under that unless the building official receives a tenant complaint, or I can see something from a public way that addresses that. Most of these come from tenant complaints, and I do them quite frequently. If the tenant complaints, then I go address the issue, and the full, we'll say, weight of the Virginia Property Maintenance Code comes into effect at that time. So it is enforceable through a tenant. The problem that I run into a lot of times is that people don't call until the day after they've been kicked out or they've moved or whatever, and they're no longer the tenant. So I can't do too much about it, but we do some.
Right.
So yeah, quite a few calls on tenant complaints.
I think when you forward along the state code then about basically condemning properties, but what I want to see, and maybe this is what Sean was kind of asking for, is like, is it purely whether the structure itself is unsafe, or like if someone is living in a situation, I mean, we see the TV shows. I'm not saying it's necessarily in Amelia, but I think about children who are maybe living in a home that is full of trash, doesn't have running water. That doesn't make technically the building itself unsafe, but that's not a healthy environment for people to be in. Is that covered in that or not?
Yeah, my interpretation of that is that if the water is no good or there is no water, then that building is not safe to inhabit. It's
Okay.
unfit for human habitation.
Okay. All right.
So it doesn't
That
just
term is more what I'm looking for. Okay.
Doesn't
Not
have
just structurally unsound. Got it. Sorry, Richard. It's a little
That's okay.
delay. Can you talk more about I think you said it's the Virginia Property Maintenance Code that Amelia did not adopt. I'm not familiar with it, and most of our board's relatively new, so maybe just kind of more of a Blake thing.
Yeah.
Do you know much about that, or maybe Jeff does? And then maybe Taylor, do you remember, was there a specific, like, Amelia considered it, chose not to, or just never reviewed?
My knowledge comes mostly from Mr. Jones, and he's much better equipped to talk to it, but it's so involved. Seemed like we would almost be having to get another employee in to enforce that. But I'll let Mr. Jones speak to that.
Well, I would agree with that, but the only thing I would add, it would take more than one employee, probably at least 3, because one of those people is going to be in court about every day. And this is, I don't have a lot of knowledge of property maintenance because I've never enforced it, but I do remember during my time in Chesterfield that it's a pretty big deal. There's a lot of work that goes on with the property maintenance. And again, a lot of localities, our size, especially rural, don't enforce property maintenance code. And you can do it fairly small, and I think you can get into it in a big way with actually doing yearly inspections of, let's say, apartment buildings or something like that. So it takes a dedicated staff of folks to run something like that.
If they start doing apartments, like rental apartments, then they would probably get into rental residential houses, so it would just keep growing.
And that's a borderline in communism there.
Well, but I think though, what I'm concerned about is we don't actually know anything about it. So I'd be careful about us making too many assumptions of what it could or couldn't do. Jeff, is that something that you could give us education on in the future so we can feel good about doing or not doing? If not, open to suggestions.
Right. Well, Richard's right. I don't know of any small localities, certainly rural ones, that have a property maintenance code program. It is very heavily administrative.
Okay.
And it's typically only in urban or heavily populated suburban localities where the need is typically felt and the costs justify the benefits justify the costs. Most of our clients are like Amelia. I don't I'll ask around in my firm. I don't know if anyone in our firm really has dealt much with a property maintenance code. I do know that it's optional, unlike the statewide building code, which every locality has to adopt and enforce. The maintenance code is optional, and I just don't know of any. Okay, and Taylor, you may be able to find from your colleagues in the region if anyone has it. Like
I'll drop my, that's enough. I'll drop my request. That helps me a lot.
Sure.
I wouldn't be so much interested in a maintenance code, but is there a way to deal with a building, particularly like in the village area, like the one that used to be behind Busick's? It was vacant for years, an eyesore, but it wasn't unsafe. Is there anything that can be done in that kind of a situation?
Is the question for me, Roger?
Yeah,
From my end, no, I can't do anything about that.
so I guess my next question would be for Jeff. Is there any way that we can empower Richard that he could do something about it in the state code?
If it's not unsafe or a public nuisance, it's really not a lot of authority in state code. There's been some recent additions to the state code to deal with blight. And even blight, and this would require a local ordinance to adopt a program and to enforce it. But even in the code sections that authorize dealing with, remedying any sort of blighted situation, that's defined as, endangering the public health, safety, or welfare, detrimental to public health, safety, or welfare, because the structures, and they can be commercial, industrial, or residential, are dilapidated, deteriorated, or violate minimum health standards. So if you're just looking at a sort of appearance and upkeep, there's not a lot of authority in state code for localities to do that. I mean, I can look at it some more for you all. There are some tools if it can be declared a public nuisance, or there's any sort of public health or safety risk. There are tools that can be adopted to address that. But if it's mainly just appearance and aesthetics and things like that on the structure, that's not a lot to enforce that.
So you talked about the blight changes at an earlier meeting. Are those, we haven't had enough time to probably review all these ordinances, Patty, and you talked about, have those blight portions not been incorporated into here then?
No, those were not in your current ordinance, and they're not in what we provided to you. We could put some provisions in there. I mean, some of it doesn't require an ordinance. If it can be declared a public nuisance, that's simply a civil action that the county would bring, and get a judgment, and then can abate the problem and become and bill the property owner or make it a tax lien. So that's a tool that doesn't require an ordinance. There are some ordinance tools that give you a little more authority, a little more prescriptive process, but again, they're all generally going to go back to the safety and public health risks posed by a structure. Now, if that is an issue, we can certainly propose a provision that would provide that tool.
Well, can you
Kind of,
go ahead?
it kind of sounds if we find something like that, and we go down that path, we're gonna be on the hook to clean it up or demolish
It
it.
sounds like it's all or nothing.
It's gonna kind of cost us money.
If it's all or nothing, I would say nothing.
What we talked about before, though, it can all be built back and placed a lien on the property. So fairly well guaranteed to get our money back.
Some.
Well,
Sometime.
yeah. Sometime, but guaranteed, yeah. Would you can you look at that blight portion, that's it, and include any recommendations then for next time? And I think, it seems to fit like what you're talking about a lot with what would be the second ordinance then with the weeds and garbage and all that other kind of stuff.
Sure. I mean, we can put something in here for, as an option. I mean, I don't, it's the will of the board. It's taking on a lot if the county wants to go down that path, but we can put some options that you can look at. It's maybe some tools that you could have on the books.
Well, I think that's the key that we've talked about as a board is the tools and the options. So having something allowed in the ordinance doesn't require us to do it every time. We don't have to go out and find buildings that meet this criteria or something. But if you don't have an ordinance related to it, then you have no option. And the reason this whole conversation got started earlier in the year was we have things we want to do and there were no options, good options for enforcement. So I think presenting us with the options to put it in, and then we can make decisions based off of that would be helpful. It doesn't commit us to put them in, nor does it commit, even if we put them in, does it commit you. I mean, we talked about, there's been things in these ordinances no one's doing anything about for years anyway.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. So that would be another standalone ordinance. So, these ordinances we talked about tonight, you guys can move those forward in the next couple of months, and we can put together a draft with some options for a blight ordinance that you all can consider as well.
Okay. All right, I'll reflect that as separate then. Thanks. Any other comments or questions related to that?
If you do a blight ordinance, does it have to be countywide? Can it be by region or district?
I don't know the answer to that. I have to look at it.
Or zoning.
I'm not an attorney, so please don't take this as such. But we did go through this when I was in Fluvanna County, this exact conversation, and that was brought up of doing it in certain areas like Columbia. And our attorney strongly was like, absolutely not. It's discriminatory. You're opening the door to a lot of issues with that. So they decided not to go that route. So take that for what it is. It was decided that doing it by district or region or neighborhood or whatever was not.
You know what it is?
You have to do all or nothing, yeah. But 2 cents.
You right.
I would agree with that. Would have to research it, but I think I agree with that.
All right, are we good to move to our last topic? Okay, solar. Brad, you want to maybe get a little background into this one since we haven't had any time to talk about it as a group. So.
Yeah, okay. So you all might remember at Planning Commission back in the spring, we talked about a very large solar project that was looking to come through the county. I think probably a lot of you have spoken to them. They're looking to come very soon, and they had a meeting with Joseph, Jeff, myself, and David last week. And they were a little bit bent about some of our regulations, one being currently in our solar ordinance, and you can pass this around. We have a regulation that says no more than 3% of the land in a 5-mile radius can be dedicated to utility scale solar. This site is going to be about 1,700 acres. They're not over that 3%, but they're brushing right up against it. So if any projects wanted to come in within that 5-mile radius, it would be a no because they've already maxed that out. So Joseph suggested that we take a look at it and see if maybe it's something worth changing or good the way it is. So I looked at some other counties, and there were 3 that have similar provisions. Halifax County has 2.5%, and so does Henry County, and Prince Edward has 5.5%. A lot of larger localities, Goochland, Louisa, Chesterfield, Dinwiddie, they don't have any density regulations, even though they have entire dedicated solar ordinances. And then there are some counties like Cumberland and Fluvanna that don't have solar ordinances at all. And it's permitted with a special exception permit, and that's it. So the,
Finish that.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear. I only asked for it to be discussed because we got feedback from the developer. I don't have a I don't have an opinion or a stance on it. I just think when we get feedback from developers, it's important we look at and consider, are we comfortable with that, particularly in a place that's, our topic is moving so much rapidly like solar.
Also, I looked in our comp plan just to see if we noted solar, if there's any specific areas we do or don't. The word solar is not in our comprehensive plan anywhere. I'm serious. I did like a control F. Solar is not in there at all. However, it's probably because solar wasn't a super poppin' thing in 2016 when they were redoing the comp plan. But we're gonna have to redo the comp plan next year, and that's probably something that's gonna take up a pretty good chunk. So at this point, as far as changing the 3%, it's really gonna come down to what y'all's goals are for the county, how open we want to be for solar. Right now, solar is permitted with a special exception permit in A5, RP5, and RR3. That's at least 95% of the county. So it is permitted in the majority of the county, just not more than 3% in a 5-mile radius. So getting rid of the 3% would allow for denser areas of solar. If we want to encourage solar as opposed to ag, residential, industrial, commercial, because some of these sites that could be used for other things are going to be locked up for 25 plus years in solar. So that's a consideration too.
Are they asking for it to be removed?
No. There was another project.
Because they're in first. The thing is, it's going to prevent anybody else
But they brought it up.
from doing,
So they
because
might-
if they're not first, then they're locked out.
Yeah.
For at least a portion. They probably wouldn't be able to do it to the scale that they want to.
And Todd's got a good point in the back part here. It's not like you can locate it anywhere in the county. It's got to be close to transmission, the high capacity transmission lines.
Right.
Right. So it can only
Gotta
be
tie it
in concentrated areas, and yet we put a limit on the concentration, you end up blocking it out, period.
I remember when we talked about this at length in the board meetings, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And the 3% was relatively arbitrary.
Well, that was
Whether it's
actually,
3 or
that's literally the
5 or
comment
whatever.
from the developers was arbitrary.
Yes, that was the exact comment.
Yeah.
I mean, it just doesn't seem like it's across the board that everyone is doing this. Most localities that do have a lot of solar going on don't have this provision in there. And I think from a planning standpoint, it makes more sense to have your solar in a dense area instead of just 200 acres here, 500 acres here, because then your whole county just looks like one big solar farm
Right.
instead of just a pocket of solar,
You
you
can
know?
also leave it the way it is and deal with it when it becomes an issue. It's not an issue right now.
So that, and if you see my second bullet point, that was, I put that exact thing in there. At this point, the 3% restriction has not been an issue.
Yeah, so
And the whole ordinance needs to be redone. But that's also dependent on how quickly you all want this changed. Redoing that entire ordinance could take a year.
Yeah.
As quickly as the regulations and stuff are changing with solar. So if this is something you want to change by the end of the year, you can't change the whole ordinance. You just have to piecemeal the things that you want immediately changed. I think it makes sense to leave it for now and just the whole ordinance and get it out of there.
The only thing I worry about when you say like it's not a problem yet is the fact that both of these companies coming in, they're paying attention to that. It could mean that they look at land and immediately rule it out because of the 3%, and we never know it becomes a
they're
problem.
not gonna do that. They're gonna come and ask for it to be changed. They're not that scared off.
I kind of just said about the industrial, commercial side, I certainly don't want to see the whole county covered in solar farm.
Well,
We
and there's,
kind of got to decide which direction we want to go. I mean,
Well, but that's the thing that I find odd about this is every one of them has to come to us as a special exception anyway. So the percentage is actually, again, back to the arbitrary, like we have to look whether it's within or without the 3%. We're going to get a vote on it every single time anyway. I agree. I don't want it all covered either. I worry about going the direction that Holly's talking about. It just then gets scattered everywhere instead of being consolidated because of this. So I'm agreeing with you, just saying, I think it could actually push the other direction too, because you can't consolidate it. Well, it was only for today for us for discussion, so.
Location's gonna be important anyway, because that's gotta be done in conjunction with the grid that power companies have too, because, we've got a lot of.
Yeah, but this prevents having a
Right.
6,000 acre
Exactly.
farm right where the group, right where the substation
Where the
is.
substation.
So that was the intent of it.
Our substations aren't big enough to handle that
No,
much
not right now.
capacity. Yeah, I mean, as of now, so.
Right. All right. Thank you for bringing it to us for discussion. We appreciate it. We have any items for closed session this evening? All right, we have reached the end of our formal agenda. We'll declare the meeting adjourned. And we'll meet next week for a much longer meeting, I'm sure.
Bye, Jeff.
Good evening.
Good night.
You're right.
Public comment section.